I see intersectionality being taken out of advanced placement African American studies because the College Board has acquiesced to the idea that intersectionality is no longer useful because it's been so politicized, I want to ask, who are you to decide what is useful to whom? There are millions of people who use intersectional thinking every day. Have you surveyed everybody? Or are you just listening to Ron DeSantis and folks in Arkansas and Texas and deciding that you're going to try to play ball with them by kicking frameworks and concepts and work under the table?
Aloha, I'm Robert Perkinson. I'm a professor in American Studies at the University of Hawai at Manoa and the director of our Better Tomorrow speaker series. And I'm very pleased to have with us today one of the leading legal minds in the country, Kimberlé Crenshaw. She's done foundational work in civil rights law, race and racism in the law, Black feminist legal theory, and has also kind of co-founded a whole school of thought in law, critical race theory. She's written landmark articles in the Stanford Law Review, the Harvard Law Review, the National Black Law Review, and other top journals. She's edited or co-authored more than 10 books, I believe. She's also been really active outside of the academy, both in shaping public discourse and in various movement projects. She was an advisor back in the early 90s to the Anita Hill's legal team in the Clarence Thomas hearing. She played a role in drafting South Africa's post-apartheid constitution, widely regarded as one of the most progressive in the world, wrote background briefs for the UN Conference on Racism that was so paradigmatic in 2001. She also writes for the New York Times and Ms. Magazine and The Nation and appears on MSNBC and NPR. And she has her own podcast, Intersectionality Matters, and so we're very pleased to have her on ours. Thank you for joining us.
Thank
Aloha.
you for having me. Thank you.
I want to start by talking about the kind of historic importance of your work. Then we'll talk some ways to the way that has circulated in popular culture and the political battles around it. And then maybe we'll close with where we go from here, what is to be done. As a historian, it seems to me that these big transitions in American history, the end of slavery, the end of Jim Crow segregation, the civil rights movement, forced us to rethink everything. And you've been one of the key intellectuals of trying to figure out how the law, in the wake of formal segregation, can continue to be an instrument of subjugation, sometimes liberation too. And I'm wondering if you might just take us back to start to the foundational moment when critical race theory came together and how some of those ideas started to be formed.
Yeah, so I think to really ground what was foundational about those early moments, and that would be like in the 80s, early 80s, I have to dial back a little bit further to being a child of the 60s. I grew up watching the civil rights movement unfold on the television. I was a kid, so of course couldn't really be part of it. But the ethos of the moment was that things were moving forward, and law was a significant mechanism for realizing the aspirations at that point of African Americans to imagine a life beyond apartheid, a life beyond segregation. So in my household, some of the heroes were lawyers. Thurgood Marshall was on our wall, along with, Martin Luther King, John Kennedy, and Jesus. There was, Thurgood Marshall. It was sort of an interesting difference, right? This is what happened in a lot of Black households. Is sort of, these are the figures that are important to us, as a people. So I grew up thinking that being a lawyer was a significant position to have to better realize these aspirations. So I always wanted to go to law school. I went to Cornell and studied Africana Studies and Government, also thinking this is sort of a perfect preparation for going to the law school and learning the special abracadabra that opens the doors to opportunity and equality. And out of that desire was my hope to study with Derek Bell, who I knew was at Harvard. He'd written this book called
first black tenured law professor.
First black
Harvard.
tenured law professor, had written a book called Race, Racism, and American Law. He had a famous course called Constitutional Law and Minority Issues. So if that's your trajectory, of course it's like, wow, can't wait to get there under Derek Bell's tutelage. Well, as the saying goes, when I got to Harvard, he had left the building. He was, I'm done with trying to transform this place through advocacy, and he'd left. As young people, and we were part of that generation that had watched some of this stuff unfold at the university level. A lot of the story of the civil rights movement kind of ends with voting rights being affirmed, but it actually continued in universities where the real struggle was the struggle around democratizing knowledge, preparing this new generation to be of service, which basically meant that the curriculum had to be expanded. The way we think about who's qualified to teach the curriculum had to be rethought. It wasn't just a matter of bringing us into those institutions, but actually rethinking the mission of the institution, which means you rethink who's qualified to do that. Well, we got to an institution that wasn't about thinking those questions.
Especially after Derek Bell left.
Especially after he left. They're like, okay, well, that was his boutique kind of course. That was sort of his personal interest, but it had nothing to do with what the university and the law school in particular thought was important. So they were moving along this trajectory, and we were students coming in, moving along another trajectory. And so that's a classic kind of moment where the sort of conflict in the expectations actually produce what King would call, a creative conflict, mm-hmm. right? It was a moment where we were able to see things differently than perhaps the generation before us. So the conflicts that actually led to critical race theory were actually about our belief that we as students were doing in higher education what the earlier generation had done in the lunch counters. This was a sit-in. This was no, you're not serving us. It is our expectation that you do serve us.
Well, that must have made them so mad.
Oh,
some
my
of
God.
Those professors.
Well, not only the law school, not only some of the professors, and let me be clear about this because it becomes relevant for the later part of the story. These are not conservatives that we're dealing with. This isn't like
right.
the University of Texas that, didn't let black people study until they were forced to, in like 1952 or something like that, or even later. This was Harvard, always thinking of itself as sort of cutting edge, liberal elite, blah, blah, blah. Yet when it came to really deeply thinking about how exclusionary structures were institutionalized in the way they did business, in the way they thought about what the
even
business,
outside of like formal
even
legal
outside
segregation
of it.
And discrimination.
And Harvard, at least with respect to race, had always a few African Americans that they let in, not women, but Charles Hamilton Houston mm-hmm. studied at Harvard Law School and went on to create the strategy that overturned segregation. So they always had a hand in some pieces of educating black lawyers, but they were not the bastion of sort of critical thinking about mm-hmm. race. So for them to be pressed to broaden their conception of what it meant to facilitate a fully integrated educational experience, for us, was sort of, it was like we were speaking another language to them. So the upshot of the conflict was that we were not only, calling in liberal professors at Harvard, the broader civil rights establishment was also sort of on edge with this new generation. Like, mm-hmm. what are you guys doing? We worked so hard to open these doors, and then you go in and you
Make
cut
control.
up and you act out. Like, what are you doing? And that was a moment of reckoning for us. We were able to see concretely. We were asking for hiring more people of color, particularly to service this course, but more broadly to integrate the faculty. And that very year, they hired 10 white males.
Wow.
10. Saying that there were no qualified people in the country that they could recruit. So sometimes you have a picture of exclusion with no words.
Yeah.
This was a picture of
Well, and
exclusion
that is a kind of color that
with
sets
the
the
words.
stage for thinking about colorblind, the way colorblind
Yeah.
racism can work.
So it made it right for us. We could visualize what the ideology was that supported an experience of exclusion. That made it legible, and that's where critical thinking came in.
And so what would you say, I know this is a more complicated question than a short answer can provide, but how did some of the key intellectual tenets come together for what those ideas would be that would coalesce into critical race theory?
You know, there's nothing like building up from the experience. So when we were told the reason why all your classes are being taught by white men is because the pool is so shallow. If you don't believe as a person of color, as a woman of color, that the world is naturally set up in such a way that the people who are most qualified to teach you are white men, you know, that's just not a reasonable proposition. The very fact that they're telling you that is like a neon sign that says this is where race and gender power exists, right here, right here. So it prompted questions. Well, how is the pool made up, right? Who decides what the pool is?
How are the positions being designed? Who's deciding?
Exactly. And so their position, I often like to say that they were kind of naturalists about it, or evolutionaries. Like, eventually, you know, the fish will develop legs and lungs and, you know, march out of the out of the pool is full, you know, but it might take...
It'll only take 350 years.
If not more.
Yeah.
So that kind of naturalizing of an exclusionary regime just opens itself up to analysis. So we began to ask, well, who in whose image is a law professor shaped? What was the period of time that the mission of the institution was created? What was the orientation of this institution to segregation? For the most part, folks in these institutions didn't think about it, didn't talk about it. It was just a naturalized set of conditions. The thinking and the creativity to break down segregation didn't really take place at Harvard or Yale or Stanford. It took place at Howard University, a black institution. So this idea that the sort of continuation of the criterion that was used to populate those institutions during a time of apartheid could seamlessly roll over to the aftermath of apartheid was obviously a flawed idea to us. So we took up the challenge of getting them to rethink not just formal exclusion, but institutional exclusion, what it served, what it continued, how it was not up to the task of creating the post segregation kind of institution that we all claim to embrace.
And when was that? You were the person who sort of coined this phrase, critical race theory. When does that first, you know, come into coalesce as a concept and begin to...
Yeah. So critical race theory was a name that sought to capture a couple of ways in which this burgeoning group was neither fish nor fowl. So at the time, there was the critical legal studies movement, and they very much were, you know, our allies in the Harvard struggle when we were trying to create our own course that answered some of the questions, some of the things we wanted to learn. They gave us independent study credit for pulling together.
And they were interested in kind of like bringing the social into the formal,
the
formal,
really exploring the myth around the law as being simply a neutral referee rather than the law actually playing a role in creating the actual interests that they otherwise say were just, managing.
You sure see that now.
You see it everywhere. And for children of the 60s who grew up with a certain kind of race consciousness, it wasn't news to us that the law wasn't neutral, right? What was news to us is how many times our other professors pretended that it was. That was a puzzle. That was truly the mystery for us. So they were allies, and we spent a lot of time with them. So we saw our project as being informed by critical perspectives on the law. Yet, critical legal studies hadn't yet elevated race as an important feature of the work that was important to do. In fact, some folks in critical legal studies, we said the problem was that they were radical with respect to economic and other material interests, but merely liberal and sometimes conservative with respect to race. Like, they could talk about how economic interests and class was socially constructed. Namely, it's not just there. It's the product of policies and politics and history. They didn't often think that with respect to race. So we had to add race to modify critical legal studies because we were talking about things that many of our allies thought was just natural, or at least they were resistant to it. On the other hand, there was a minority legal section of people who were studying civil rights law, constitutional law, but they weren't particularly critical about it. The idea was just figuring out how do we maneuver law to get it to discover the real and true aspirations of the Constitution. So we were kind of both and not either. So at a certain point, I began to try to collect names of people who were doing work that seemed to be in that in-between space. And we were given the opportunity at Wisconsin to bring all these people together. So the question is, what are we inviting people to, right? Why come here?
This is when you're like a kind of doing a post-law degree at?
Yes, I was in my first year as a law professor at UCLA. So I've been there for a couple at Wisconsin and then went on to UCLA. And we just decided, it's time for us to all really come together and see what pulls our work together. What is it that makes us betwixt and between neither fish nor fowl, but there is something here. So in sending out the invitation, we said, we're inviting you to explore new developments in critical race theory, as though there had been a critical race theory. It's sort of like how people put up red velvet ropes, so there's like a line outside, like, ooh, we want to really get in. It's
Everybody
like,
get in
there's
line.
nothing in there yet, but you guys are going to be the folks that populate this. Yeah.
Mari Matsuda, who was probably at this original gathering, a colleague of mine here at UH and a longtime friend of yours, also said that she wrote recently that in addition to providing this kind of post-civil rights critique of the ways that racial discrimination and subjugation continue after the end of formal segregation, she also argued, I think maybe it comes out of this gathering, that the ability to come together as a collective and form identity and demands out of that community were important too.
It was essential. It was essential. Part of power, part of the construction of power, is being able to legitimately aggregate a set of experiences, have it affirmed with other people, and see yourselves as part of, a broader collective that has legitimacy, that is reaffirmed by all of the different perspectives. that help constitute what the knowledge is that you are generating. So in this space, we had people who were thinking about race from a housing perspective, from a corporate perspective, from a family law perspective, from an employment perspective, education. The tendency up until that point was that race was relevant in the conventional approach to law only as a way of thinking about discrimination,
Voting access
or voting,
right,
but not in the way that laws actually help create the institutionalized and structural dimensions of white dominance across society more broadly. So everybody was coming to that space with a level of expertise at a different juncture. It's sort of like, create the elephant. Everybody has a little bit of it. And in drawing it out, we're able to see the whole of it far more clearly than if we were only looking at it from one perspective.
which is amazing how much that vision of the elephant now, within the academy anyway, people who engage in critical studies of society across fields see that.
Yeah.
Thanks
yeah.
to this work in a way that they didn't before.
And a lot of it was influenced by where all of us had been coming from. So some of us grew up watching what happened in San Francisco State with the Black Studies curriculum. Some of us came up out of Cornell, where there was a fight over actually creating Africana studies, and then more broadly ethnic studies at Berkeley and other institutions. So we understood the power of knowledge production. We
Right.
understood the power of the university.
Well, and ideas,
Yeah.
sounds like you're saying they come from movements and the clash of movements with power, not just from
Not just from
brilliant
sitting
minds.
in your office and
Right.
assuming the position of the philosopher. Right?
Which makes sense. If those ideas are really going to have legs, they have to
Yes.
be able to circulate.
That's right. That's right.
At the same time that you're involved in this, pretty much at the same time, it seems like you're also working to upend feminism, and you coin this and bring kind of analysis of gender discrimination, class discrimination, and racial discrimination together. And you also coined this other term, intersectionality, that has gained a great deal of currency. How, for people who haven't read some of that foundational work, maybe first, how did you define that then?
Yes. Well, here's a story as well. So intersectionality also, in some ways, came out of the experience at Harvard as being a student organizer, demanding that the law school take seriously the need to broaden its conception of who can be a law professor. And even some of the efforts to do so were unfortunately divided up between recruiting people of color and recruiting women. And,
Right.
you know how this story goes. The people of color, don't have women in it in the...
Well, we know how the story goes because
Yes.
you've told us in some ways.
Well, and that was kind of the point of departure. Like, where are the women of color in this? So I was really curious about whether this, the race committee is only looking at men, and the women's community or the women's committee is only looking at white women.
So you get white women and black men, and that's it.
And that's it. Like, so, all the blacks and men, all the women and white are white. Some of us are brave. It was the name of a women's studies book. I was really curious about how does the law provide the apparatus for maintaining that idea? How does the law respond, to that reality that kind of formulation leaves women of color, basically unmarked, and therefore their discrimination, their discriminatory experiences unremedied. So when I left Harvard, I went to Wisconsin basically with a goal of thinking about both these questions, critical race theory and intersectionality. I wrote both of those articles while I was a grad student at the
Wow.
University of Wisconsin. And, nothing helps you think about the problem other than being presented with the problem. So the problem that I was presented with was a case in which black women were trying to.
Oh, this is the employment discrimination case.
This is DeGraff and Reed, and
Right,
this
okay.
is basically a black woman representing other black women saying, "Look, this company is discriminating against me as a black woman," and the courts were unable to hear that, partly because they associated race discrimination with what was happening to men who were black and gender discrimination in terms of what was happening
And
to white
refresh our
women who were
memory.
black.
So the company was hiring
So the company
African Americans
was,
in the assembly.
like many industries at the time, race and gender segregated. So there was a problem from the start, right? So most of the jobs for black people were floor jobs, industrial jobs, maintenance, custodial work. And most of the jobs for women were front office jobs, receptionists, secretaries, etc. So this is already a problem, right? But it's also packing inside of it a gender exclusion, a race exclusion.
Right.
So women were not thought appropriate for those kinds of floor level jobs. And black people were not thought to be appropriate for being a secretary, front office work. So effectively, this work segregation meant that there wasn't really a pathway for black women to come in and to rise up. So Emma DeGraff and Reed said, look, I'm discriminated against as a black woman, but the court was like, you can't prove that you were excluded because of race, because look, the company does hire black people. And you can't prove gender discrimination because the company does hire women. It just means that the black people they hired aren't your gender, and the women they hire are not your race. And for
because the
some
court couldn't
reason,
see the intersection.
They couldn't see the intersection, and they thought that this is the real kicker. They thought that allowing Emma DeGraff and Reed to combine her cause of action, you're practicing gender discrimination within your race hiring and race discrimination within your gender hire, was somehow illegitimate. Somehow they were asking the court to do something for them that the court wasn't being asked to do for men or for women. But of course, black men or white women didn't need the court to combine two causes of action to be able to read their story. So my sense was, why is it that the court couldn't see that it was discriminating against black women by saying to create a cause of action or to allow you to plead this way, because you're the only group right now that needs it, is preferential treatment? Like, what would make them think that that was preferential treatment rather than their failure to do that was actually discriminating against them? So for me, it was a remedial question, meaning they needed remedial education about how discrimination actually functions. So I began looking for metaphors. I'm a metaphoric thinker. It's like, so what could I use as a platform to say, it's just like this? And intersections seem to be that. They go through intersections every day with, traffic going in lots of different directions. And when they collide and interrupt a legitimate expectation of someone to employment, that is a form of discrimination. So the idea was basically meant just to put a prism on something that was actually happening, a magnifying glass, so they could better see it.
It seems like a lot of your work actually is motivated by trying to help us see what is actually apparent and measurable and everywhere, but for ideological or formal legal reasons we somehow can't see.
Yeah.
And you've done this a lot in terms of violence and discrimination against black women. Including, some of the work on intersectionality and battering, I think, some of your work. I just think, wonder if you might tell us how intersectionality works. We kind of have some sense from you in the employment discrimination. How does it start to work in conceiving properly of violence in a way that might lead to redress?
Yeah. So, initially I thought the problem was a legal problem. But subsequently, working with people who were working on violence against women, it became clear that the law was not the only source of the problem. It was actually our advocacy strategies, the way we conceptualize, social problems, the way we frame identities as various subjects of a problem rather than the way institutional and structural dynamics actually create the disadvantage. So shortly after the first article about employment, I started, to become, conversant with the effort to politicize violence against women, which was an important moment. This was happening in the late 80s. This was a moment when the whole idea of domestic violence was moving from an idea of family pathology to an idea of patriarchy and gender power. So interpersonal violence was taking on a greater sort of politicized reality to people. They were able to name it in a different way. So I was all about that. It was really, really interesting and an important work. But what I was also recognizing is that the backdrop against which many of these claims were being made was one that was either exclusively framed as a gender problem or a race problem. And there was a lot of tension between feminist communities and anti-racist communities around how to think about violence. So take rape, for example. Rape conventionally within anti-racist communities is a very, very dicey issue because of the history of lynching, because of the false accusation, because of the understanding about how vulnerable African American men historically have been to false allegations of rape. That's real. But what's missing from that is how vulnerable Black women were to sexual assault and how unresponsive the criminal justice system has historically been to that. So there was a gendered dimension to the problem of sexualized violence, which wasn't being named. It wasn't being named in anti-racist discourses. And it really wasn't being named in feminist discourses as well. So there was this big gap between how feminists were talking about it and how anti-racists were responding to it. So again, my sense was we need a framework to be able to say this and that. Yes, there has been a history of lynching in which racialized violence against Black men was prompted by or justified with the false narrative of Black male aggression. And there's also a history of aggression towards Black women, both interracial and intraracial, not being taken seriously. So intersectionality was actually a product of intersectionality in interpersonal violence was a product of trying to figure out how do we speak to this complicated dynamic.
In the realm of harassment, of course, that really comes to the fore in the Clarence Thomas hearings with him, using this language of high-tech lynching to try to...
It worked beautifully for Clarence Thomas. So just to, to bring people into that moment, I was working with Anita Hill's legal team while I was writing. I had just actually finished writing this article around how Black women are marginalized in this entire conversation. And my concern was that Anita Hill was going to be subject to all of the stereotypes that get attached to Black women, partly as a product of a long history of Black women being sexualized, Black women being aggressed upon. This is effectively what justified enslavement and forcibly, breeding Black women. You had to think that their sexual autonomy was basically non-existent. They didn't exercise, any ability to sort of determine their own sexuality. This has been part of our history, and it has never been unwritten. That, therefore, means that when Black women testify, their race is often more significant in whether they're believed than any other factor in a rape case, whether it's the level of violence sustained, whether she was an acquaintance. Race sort of trumps all of that.
Yeah, and you've written how this persists with the
R. Kelly. In R. Kelly, I mean, we could go on and on. So my worry was that in a sexual harassment case, the same thing was going to happen. She was going to be read as, basically not credible.
Even though she as a
because of
person
that.
is hard to read that way.
If you don't have sort of these racial lens
Yeah.
on a black woman's, sort of history, you would read it that way. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how effectively he was able to wrap himself up in this history of lynching. His first response, basically, to Anita Hill's story was this was a high-tech lynching. So I didn't expect that he was going to say that because he'd been such a critic of race claims in the past. But when your aspiration is on the line, I guess there's no bar to going back and picking up this race card and playing it. And what I also hadn't expected was how effective it was going to be. So going into the hearing, African Americans in the civil rights community more broadly was split, but mostly against him. When Anita Hill came forward and then he played the race card of high-tech lynching, it reversed. And it reversed in part because a lot of people didn't know the history of black women and sexual harassment, didn't know that Rosa Parks was a rape crisis advocate before she refused to give up her seat on that, Montgomery bus. They were unaware that black women plaintiffs were some of the first plaintiffs to help create sexual harassment laws. So they were seeing Anita Hill through the eyes of what a white woman would feel and say, as though black women didn't have feelings and didn't oppose and resist sexual harassment all these years. In fact, the New York Times printed an op-ed by a very famous black academic, effectively saying that Anita Hill might be telling the truth about what Clarence Thomas said to her, but she wasn't being truthful about being offended by it or about being damaged by it, because this was widely recognized as down-home courting.
Oh, wow.
That a black woman would know how to receive and deal with. So it was basically a cultural defense to sexual harassment that left black women without protection. This is the consequence of these intersectional failures.
Without autonomy or boundaries
And,
or any
yeah,
ability to defend oneself.
without any ability to understand the history of what's happened to black women. And that in turn, I'll just end with this, it's not black women that were damaged by that ignorance. It is our entire democracy. If we look at all of the decisions that have been made since then that got us to this point, that were 5-4 decisions, including striking down the Voting Rights Act, campaign finance reform, affirmative action, I mean, we could go on and on. Those were made possible because of that intersectional failure, which put Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court.
Which brings us back to how the Supreme Court really historically has functioned for most of American history, not at that moment when you were a child aspiring maybe to be a lawyer, with this moment of opening when the Supreme Court was a mechanism for change.
history.
Before that, it had been more,
Yeah,
and is now again,
yeah,
and was designed to be the kind of check on popular democracy.
yeah.
There's a new so there's this long-standing through line of your work on harassment and violence against black women, and the way that that's eclipsed by or obscured by narrow sets of glasses. Around the time as the Black Lives Matter movement is taking shape, there's kind of a new formation of that you're involved in, that's culminated in this new book, Say Her Name. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the origins of that project.
Yeah.
And also the way that it's come into this book, which is the most recent one that you've published.
Yeah, so many of these lines just, are continuous. So we ended up, by we, I mean my organization is called the African American Policy Forum, and we had been hosting a series of town halls all over the country, somewhat in response to the last term of the Obama administration, when he finally turned to deal with race. He dealt with race as a gender-exclusive project, focusing primarily on black men and boys. This was an outgrowth of the Trayvon Martin, homicide, and his sense that black boys needed sort of special attention because of the converging ways in which their lives were put at risk. It was a bit of a curiosity that the program actually focused on, sort of healthy mentoring and fatherhood initiatives when, the thing that killed Trayvon Martin was not the absence of a mentor or the absence of a father, but the presence of a racist who was basically, able to hunt him down and kill him without any consequences. But the upshot is that the inference was that black girls and women were doing okay, or at least they could wait. So our Why We Can't Wait campaign was an effort to tell communities things that they probably saw but didn't really incorporate into their frameworks on youth in crises. Black girls were also in crises, but we didn't call it that. We didn't name it that, partly because we weren't elevating some of the things that happened in their lives. So we had been doing these town halls, and one of the things that was constantly being talked about was black women and girls as subjects of police violence. Not just institutional involvement with the criminal justice system, but actually targets of police violence. And this wasn't coming up in some of the movements. So
they are in prisons. That is that at that time was the fastest growing.
They were the fastest growing, partly as a consequence, a long-term consequence of the war on drugs and the way that it allowed people to turn on other people in the enterprise, which often was women. So there were a lot of things that were happening that weren't being named. So when Eric Garner was killed, when Mike Brown was killed, there were protests and marches. We participated in those protests and marches, demanding, accountability, but also ensuring that the names of women and girls who had also, suffered from police violence were incorporated. What we learned at these marches is that, number one, a lot of people had no notion that black women and girls were objects of this kind of police violence. And some people were very positive about the fact that we were bringing this to the fore. There were others that were not so welcoming. There was a sense that we were interloping, that this was effectively a black male issue, and there was no space to be able to broaden it, have a gender lens that included people who were not socialized and understood to be men. So that was quite literally the moment that we began to say her name. We're in the march with the posters and we say her name, right? Yes, say Mike Brown, but also say Tanisha Anderson, who was killed just a couple weeks before Tamir Rice. Say Michelle Cusseau, who was killed 5 days after Mike Brown. We have to understand that this is a broader set of risks than just being a black man. It's not taking away from the risks of being a black man. It is adding to that this is a cross-gender vulnerability, and we need to talk about all of its dimensions in order to get a handle on it and to demand the kind of interventions that we need.
It seems like this project is also a storytelling.
Yes, it is.
Enterprise, which is maybe different than some of your other interventions in writing. Like, why storytelling? What are stories that we need to know that we might not?
Yeah. So
why do we need to know them?
I think political movements, especially social justice movements, are driven by narrative. They are driven by this is the experience on the ground, and this experience is unjust, particularly as we think about it in terms of what the promises are, what we say we're about, or what our values really are. My sense is that without the story, you really can't press people to broaden the frame. You really can't say to folks, well, your framework needs to actually include women. You can't say that unless you say, and here's why. So the book, Say Her Name, is a compendium of the stories that have been told over the years of Say Her Name by the survivors of black women who themselves did not survive encounters with police. And we hear both about the similar kinds of risks that black women, face. Driving while black actually is a point of vulnerability because police are constitutionally able to encounter us and stop us even if it's racially motivated, because the Fourth Amendment gives them that right, we disproportionately come out of those encounters with constitutional injuries, and sometimes death. So that's something that happens with black women, but also what happens with black women in particular is that being with their children is not a protection against this kind of violence. Many of the women whose
Yeah,
stories
some
are
of these
told,
stories are
the children are
raging.
with them, and sometimes the children are actually shot when the police are shooting mothers. And, you know, when you consider that black women are the group that is most unlikely to be armed when they're killed, and many of these women have their children with them, it's telling us that black womanhood, black motherhood, is not a prophylactic. It doesn't do what we think it does to differentiate black women's vulnerability from black men. So only telling these stories do people get a chance to see what the contours of vulnerability to anti-black racism through state-sanctioned violence actually looks like. That is what invites people to bear witness, which is overarchingly the objective of what we're doing. Bear witness, say her names, tell her stories. That's the way we address the loss of the lost, the erasure of what actually these black women have experienced.
And like a lot of your other work that are idea driven, politically driven, but also movement connected, how have you, as a law professor and intellectual, worked with the organizations of mothers themselves, survivors, family members of,
Yeah.
of women who've been killed by police?
So one of the most significant things that we've contributed is providing the space for them, in the same way that we were talking earlier about how critical race theory actually came about, by mutual recognition, understanding what we have in common, believing that what we're putting out there is a legitimate expression of our vulnerability, and a demand that that vulnerability be addressed. That's exactly what's happened with the mothers of women who've been killed by the police, and now we have daughters of women who've been killed by the police and sisters of women who have been killed by the police. What we came to understand is that a lot of the survivors, didn't know that they were not simply a group of one. Because you don't hear the names and you don't have the stories, some of them thought that they were exceptionally unlucky, or somehow their loved ones were exceptionally sort of vulnerable or warranted this kind of police violence. It's only when they came together and started saying, that happened to you, that happened to me, that happened to your grandchild, that happened to my grandchild. People were saying, well, what was that? What was your daughter doing with that person? Same thing happened to me. They were able to build out a narrative, an understanding about the common sources of vulnerability. That is an integration of all of the particulars into a whole that allows them to speak more forcefully, more legitimately, to both the anti-police violence movement. You need to incorporate this, and also to the broader, sort of policy-making institutions. You need to address these particular vulnerabilities. That makes black women more safe, black people more safe, but everybody more safe if we can address these issues.
Your work has had so many breakthroughs, like bringing terms to public discourse that didn't have language for them before, or changing the frames in ways that allowed what should have been obvious to become more visible and discussed, bringing names that should be known into the public. But, and that's an amazing and rare accomplishment as a writer and an advocate. But now your career is also in the public sphere taken this peculiar turn, in that much of your work has turned from kind of keywords to cudgels. And the right wing in this new chapter of the culture wars has really latched on to some of specifically the terms that you've advanced, critical race theory and intersectionality, and therefore probably more people by the numbers might have heard of critical race theory from Tucker Carlson than from you. Why do you think this is? Why do you think the backlash to your work is so ferocious, and why now?
Have to take a sip of water on that one.
Sorry, we don't have anything stronger.
Yeah. Oh man, why now? There are many theories about why now, right? There are the people that are saying because we've been winning. There are those who
Let's
say,
hope it's that one.
yeah, we've been winning. These are the last gasps. More and more people are able to see, and so the effort to obscure really does focus on the kind of prisms that open up and make things far more legible, for people. I think there's a mix of all these things. I don't think the fact that we are winning necessarily means that we can be calm about this, right? There are many stories from history to sports where people are coming from behind and they overtake and win in the end. So, I don't think there's an inevitability about this or a signal that the fact that they're attacking our concepts and our terms means that, we're on the trajectory to victory. I think
White supremacy is pretty hard to vary. History suggests.
And it just keeps coming back. As I have said before, when you see people playing the same play over and over again, the same offense, and our defense is not up to the task to anticipate it, it does really raise the question, what are we doing? Why are we not able to grasp this? So I've seen over the last 4 years us doing the same thing. The right goes over a concept or a frame or a term that allows us to talk to each other, to actually be able to say, well, we know what this is. They go after the term. And what many of us do is pivot away from the term rather than actually stand and fight it. And I think we generate the false belief that we can continue to do what we do and communicate, but just now we have another wink, wink, nod, nod. Winks and nods don't help us actually describe and convey to each other what is actually happening. So every time they push us away from a set of concepts, a set of words that have come out of struggle, it's a losing proposition for us. It's not as easily it's not as easy for us to pivot as some people think. So I've been more frustrated over the last couple of years with the reaction of allies and scholars and institutions to the heckler's veto. I mean, at the end of the day, we're not talking about a lot of people. We're just talking about people with a big megaphone. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason they have a big megaphone is, number one, mainstream media have given them the megaphone. So they start yelling about something over and over and over again, way out to the right. It gets amplified by Fox News. And then eventually the mainstream media comes in and they're asking about it or reporting it with this both sidesism. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's not even that. It's, here's the complaint about critical race theory so what actually is critical race theory? Mm-hmm. Or what is it that is actually being taught about race in higher education? What in K through 12? What are they telling us they're going after? Had they done that, they would have seen that actually they're going after all of race-conscious education. They're going after the entire apparatus of diversity, equity, and inclusion. They're going after every way in which critical thinking about race and intersectionality has elevated agendas that have actually transformed our institutions. Had they asked that, people wouldn't be shocked right now that diversity, equity, and inclusion institutions are collapsing everywhere. They would have been better prepared for it. So that's, what gets under my craw. And then at the last point of this, when I see intersectionality being taken out of advanced placement African American studies, because the College Board has acquiesced to the idea that intersectionality is no longer useful because it's been so politicized. I want to ask, who are you to decide what is useful to whom? There are millions of people who use intersectional thinking every day. Have you surveyed everybody? Or are
Right.
you just listening to Ron DeSantis and folks in Arkansas and Texas and deciding that you're going to try to play ball with them by kicking frameworks and concepts and work under the table? The ease in which they've been able to do that is really disturbing.
Yeah, and I think the sanguine view is that this is sort of dead end or rhetorical hyperventilation, but
Yeah.
these are real institutional gains if, the gains that were made in curriculum that you were talking about at the beginning are being
Unraveled.
significantly rolled back.
Yeah.
If all sorts of offices in different companies and universities are being defunded or circumscribed.
And money being shifted to security, policing.
Right.
Yeah.
Books being,
Banned.
maybe some books getting banned that will allow them greater circulation, but the numbers are so great now that are getting pulled from.
More books being banned at this period of time than we've experienced in decades, and a disproportionate number of those books, between 30 and 40%, feature characters of color, are written by people of color, or queer people and issues. So they are going directly at not just subject matter, but viewpoint oriented censorship. This is supposedly the most questionable kind of censorship. All the free speech people up until this moment were up in arms about viewpoint censorship. This runs counter to everything that we say free speech is about. Yet in 23 states, there are actually laws that are being used to justify the ban, laws that prohibit divisive concepts.
And these, it's too early to have these really subjected to legal scrutiny.
Well, there are cases that are going right now.
But look what they're going up to.
Exactly, they're going up to a Supreme Court that, has lost credibility, on these issues. There are about 24 million school children now, almost half, go to school in states and in districts where there is now a legal limit on what can be taught. Things like the story of Ruby Bridges, who was,
Right,
the
goodness.
6-year-old who integrated New Orleans public schools. There are parents who have complained, and the stories have been removed because telling her story about being a child subject to segregation is thought to violate the rights of white children because it might make them feel bad. So the truthful history is being censored out of our curriculum. That is something that everybody, anti-racist, pro-democrats, by Democrats I mean pro-democracy people, should be concerned about. But there's such a disconnect between the fight to survive, an anti-racist agenda and the fight for our democracy to survive, that these things are not being talked about as overlapping and as flip sides of the same coin.
It's interesting to think about this now, almost exactly 70 years after Brown versus Board of Education, and you've written a lot or talked a lot about the legacy of that case. How do you think this current set of flashpoints cast that case in new light or more proper light than it's sometimes conventionally conceived?
Well, yeah, this is the 70th anniversary. Actually, it was just Friday, May 17th, where everybody came together to celebrate. But in reality, this should be a moment that causes us to recapture what Brown was actually about. Now Brown has been miscast by this current Supreme Court as a right against race consciousness, a right against classification, when in fact what Brown was a right against caste. It was a right against being classed as second-class citizens. And one of the key dimensions to Brown that can usefully be recaptured is the connection that the court itself made to democracy. The court said that segregation undermined the capacity of those subjected to it to full participation in this democracy.
Economically, too.
Economically, and this was a robust understanding of what's necessary to actually function as a full multiracial democracy. That part of Brown has been scrubbed, from the case. And to hear this Supreme Court talk about Brown, Linda Brown and all the other black plaintiffs were damaged not because of the message of second-class citizenship, not because they had to walk past all white schools to an inferior black school, not because being subjected to this kind of segregation was simply a point of information for everybody that indicated what black people were meant for and who they were. This court has put all of that stuff aside and essentially said that Linda Brown was being damaged by segregation in the same way that the white kids who were joyfully playing in their better funded schools were being damaged by. It was everybody was experiencing the damage of race conscious school assignment. And so by distorting Brown, they are now able to say all race consciousness is actually the same. So taking race into account for segregation is as damaging and unconstitutional as taking race into account for diversity.
Teaching about slavery is as damaging.
Exactly. I mean, the Supreme Court had once said that that's confusing a no trespass sign with the welcome mat. Of course, these things are completely different. But when this court is able to erase history, is able to simply say, all of the contextual realities of apartheid and white supremacy and discrimination, they don't matter. In fact, they don't matter so much that we can't even talk about them. When that is their agenda, it is the effort to actually make it make sense to say that the no trespass sign and the welcome mat are one and the same. These two projects are deeply connected. They're connected in their minds. They're clear about that. The problem is we're not clear about that.
You've tried to affect change in so many arenas, in scholarship, in the courts, on the streets, in literature. Like, at this moment, you've talked about recapturing. Like, what do you think must be done in order to recapture, vitalize some of these concepts so that they can be useful for change and wrest them back from the distorted brandishing that they're suffering?
Well, I think the first step is we have to resist the belief that we can maneuver our way out of this situation.
By retreating and parrying.
By retreating, by pivoting, by just coming up with, new names or telling the history in a different way. They are coming after the very idea that we live in a society in which the history of it still shapes the way our society functions. There is no way to parry that other than to actually resist it. This isn't something that we can negotiate our way out of. And I think there's just too many instances of that strategy not being successful for us to continue to do that. If we are all about democracy and racial inclusion, we cannot bend to the frameworks of those who have shown that that's not what their values and agendas are all about. So I think being more literate about how these agendas are unfolding, what it looks like, and making sure that our civic institutions and our intermediary institutions stand with us in fighting rather than trying to accommodate this, like what the College Board did, for example, and many other institutions like that. So I think that's absolutely key. I think we also have to recognize that we can't win an asymmetric war. And we are in an asymmetric war. We're in an asymmetric war in part because the anti-democracy forces and the anti-racial justice forces are far more conversant with what they're are going after. They are far more prepared to go after the concepts that hold multiple coalitions together than we are prepared to defend them. When that is the state of play, it's almost impossible to imagine winning when we can't get on the same page
Because
about
we haven't done enough institution building?
we haven't done enough institution building. We haven't really challenged our own demons. So we're at a point where you mentioned earlier that more people have heard about critical race theory from Tucker Carlson than they've heard from the New York Times, or that they've heard from elected officials. So it was easy to distort it or to make people feel that they had no interest in it because the paper of record, or because elected officials or people who are actually doing critical work about race haven't really said that that's what they're doing. They haven't taken up these issues. I think just a couple weeks ago, Marjorie Taylor Greene went onto the floor of Congress with a "Say Her Name" T-shirt on it. The first time "Say Her Name" was actually uttered in Congress after the 10 years that "Say Her Name" has been a movement. The fact that the first person who brought "Say Her Name" onto the floor was done by someone who doesn't care at all about what the movement is really about, but simply was appropriating the framework
As a kind of anti-immigrant
as an
demagoguery.
anti-immigrant framework is a problem both about the right weaponizing and basically gentrifying our concepts and terms. That's a problem. But it's also a problem that our elected officials and our media and, the broader civil society hadn't really been taking up these issues. So it's an opportunity crisis, and the opportunity was created because we weren't there in the first place. So much of the ambivalence about really confronting what the legacy of race and racism along with patriarchy is across all our institutions, we haven't had the kind of robust engagement with these realities as we should have. So that created an opening, and where there's an opening, just like water, right-wing politics and really very anti-democratic elements will flow into those spaces. So it's both a matter of resisting that flow, but filling up those spaces with a concrete, honest legacy of what we've been as what we need to deal with today to make this country more of what we think it needs to be.
Looking forward, to through the next election, like where do you think you'll put your energies next in trying to do that, trying to face and fight rather than retreat, fill space, educate, organize, advance?
Well,
what are some ideas you have for how we can do that, or how you'll be doing it in the near term?
so I've just come off of the launching of Freedom Summer 2024. So that's another anniversary. We're looking at the 60th year anniversary of Freedom Summer. And, for viewers who aren't as familiar with Freedom Summer was the moment when young SNCC activists decided that they were going to create a vote registration drive along with an education drive, understanding that our political disempowerment goes hand in hand with our narrative disempowerment, with illiteracy around how the lost cause, the idea that the Civil War was not fought to maintain slavery but to defend Southern honor, actually has been integrated throughout our entire school system and our self-conception in a way that makes white supremacy appear to be more natural. Everybody was taught some version of how horrible Reconstruction was. Everybody was taught some version of why black people were not seen to be fit for their own liberation. So the idea of Freedom Summer was to go and unlearn some of these ways that subordinated people are taught to believe that their subordination is legitimate. We are at a similar inflection point where there's a fight over what gets learned, a fight over how deeply critical we are about what has been taken for granted. So we launched this on May 3rd. It's our annual day of mass action around our freedom to learn. We believe that we need to take back the framework of freedom because it is our freedom that's being undermined by some of these crazy policies. It is our freedom that is on the chopping block if, the playbook from the Heritage Foundation called Project 2025 that wants to abolish the Department of Education. They want to replace everybody with, political hacks. They want to undermine the EEOC that is all about creating data to understand discrimination. They want to roll back anti-discrimination law. This is all the stuff that is at stake. For us to fight it, we have to be able to understand it, and that means people have to have free and open access to as much information as possible. So we've been giving away books. We have a banned book tour. We go everywhere, trying to give away the information that people don't want folks to have. And we're working with all the civil rights organizations, racial justice organizations, to make this summer Freedom Summer 2024. So there are activities happening in all of the conventions, in grassroots organizations, to elevate the need to be fully defensive against the effort to make us illiterate, to fight for this information so we can fight for our country.
That Freedom Summer is significant too. I think it combined education, door-to-door organizing.
Yes.
As well as big political ambitions that might not have, and they didn't carry the day in the 1964 Democratic Convention, but they had effects.
Yes, long-term effects, and the situation now is, similarly, indeterminate. It's unclear what's going to happen. It's unclear, but one thing is clear: if we don't fight, we don't win.
That's
what's clear.
That's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your fight and your insight. I'm Robert Perkinson. We thank you very much for being with us, for coming to Hawaii for this conversation. Better Tomorrow Speaker Series is a joint venture of UH, Hawaii Community Foundation, and Kamehameha Schools. We hope to have you back to give a big talk when you finish your next book, which is a memoir, I understand.
Yes.
So we hope we can celebrate with you on that again and all carry the fight forward. Thank you very much.
I look forward to being back. Thank you.